So today we have, it's supposed to be 6 presentations, but I'm seeing 5 persons here with us. And each person will have 15 minutes for their presentation. We're trying to keep strictly to time, so that will allow us to have some time for good discussion following. So we'll have our presentations, and then that will be followed with about 30 minutes discussion. So what I'll do is I'll move directly to the first presentation, and I want to invite Dr. Ishtar Govaya to make her presentation, and the name of the presentation is Psychological Science and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, National, Regional, and International Collaboration.
Thanks to Noreen. It's always nice as a Trinidadian to have another Trinidadian say your name because they get it right. So, what was that?
They're saying that to big one here.
Oh, beg your pardon. Twin Island Republic. Twin Island. I'm just focusing on that.
Yes.
So today I am going to be speaking with you about an initiative and telling you a little bit about the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. What exactly is CANPA? That's the acronym for the Caribbean Alliance of National Psychological Associations. We are a regional network of national organizations and groupings of psychologists throughout the Caribbean. And our mandate is to advance psychological knowledge, research, skills, and practice in the service of Caribbean well-being and development as we attempt to address professional needs as well. We do this through multiple types of mechanisms, including the sponsoring of conferences every 2 years, regional conferences in psychology. And we also do it through providing resources and guidance on the status, structure, and development of psychology in the region. We've been established, and I'll speak to you a little bit more, just briefly in passing, because of a regional consensus, a regional mandate, and we have the guidance of the member countries of the International Union of Psychological Science. So this is a depiction of how we are organized. So we are guided, our General Assembly consists of members and representatives from each of our member countries. As of this point, we have 14 member countries. They, as I mentioned, constitute our General Assembly. That General Assembly is served by a Presidents and Elders Council, an Executive Council, and an International Advisory Committee. And then supporting that middle level, we have multiple standing committees. We have a standing committee for our biannual CRCP, Caribbean Regional Conferences of Psychology. We have one for professional practice and standards, another for psychology education and training, yet another for publications and communications, and another for finance and fundraising. And in each of those standing committees, our aim, it's not the reality at this point yet, but our aim is to ensure that we have representatives from each of our member countries. Our member associations come from the Dutch, French, Spanish, and English Caribbean, and we also have a group of psychologists who are based in countries that do not yet have a national psychological associations. So just to recall, the membership of CANPA is a membership at a national level, so it's at a country level, which means that the country has to have a national psychological association. If the country does not have a national psychological association, it doesn't mean that we don't welcome in persons from those countries into the alliance. As a matter of fact, this unaffiliated regional members is taking that particular group into consideration. So there are some countries in which their national associations are fledgling. There are some in which there may be just one person, one trained psychologist, or one person who, and that training may be at the master's level, it could be at the doctoral level. But we're not excluding them. We're just saying that we need to see an infrastructure in place before you become a national member. And until then, you can be part of our unaffiliated membership. Our Executive Council, this is just a little visual of who we are and a list of names there. Many of us have been there since the inception. The inception of the group of us was at the Caribbean Regional Conference of Psychology 2011, which was seed funded with a grant from the International Union of Psychological Science, as well as some other international organizations. We've had a few accomplishments in the short time that we've been alive, our own lifespan, and including some publications. My colleague Guillermo and I are co-chairs of the Publication Standing Committee, and we have held 3 conferences to date. Our first in the Bahamas, our second in Suriname, and our third was in Haiti just last year. Our 4th is next year in Cuba. And let's talk a little bit now about the International Union of Psychological Science and CANPA and how we see our relationship with the Sustainable Development Agenda. SALISES, as it's called, is focusing on a development agenda. And that development agenda is going hand in hand with the SDG of development agenda, really thinking about how does psychology serve humanity. As part of that, there's been a presidential task force that's convened, and that task force had 2 main mandates. One was to look at what already exists, and the second part of that was to think about what else is necessary. So when we looked at psychological sciences engagement with the UN, to date we have a coalition at the UN. We also have more informal ways of interacting with the UN, such as through our work with HealthNet, our work and our volunteering in terms of the ICD-10 revision, our work and collaborations as far as MHGAP is concerned, and our work with disaster mental health. And in terms of what we are noting, just from those areas of work and collaboration together, what we felt and experienced are some barriers in terms of accessing UN agencies in national and regional contexts. So through that initial assessment, we've recommended increasing engagement with the UN and then prioritizing the 2030 Development Agenda as an organizing framework for IPSAI's strategic engagement with the UN. Because we believe that psychology has a very critical role to play in virtually all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see that our national member states, our national member associations really have a much more active part to play. So with this in mind, we've developed a preliminary strategic plan. And the components of this plan are a database of experts, because we're looking at psychology and the Global Development Agenda. Looking at psychology and the 2030 SDG agenda, again in terms of education, promoting awareness and engagement. And third, looking at it in terms of psychology education and training, really thinking about sustainability here and how can we build a transformative foundation that has as its goal sustainability. For the first component of this preliminary strategic plan, this database development, we have multiple goals in mind, multiple indicators of success for us. One is the establishment of a database, a global database of psychology practitioners that is then broken down and is specific according to countries. IUPSAIS, as the International Union of Psychological Associations, is the umbrella, and under that there are regional associations, and under each regional associations we have our country member states. And it's at that umbrella level that we want to really be building a thorough, complete database. And then we will use that database of global experts to develop a task force, and we're going to ensure that there is really strong Caribbean representation in that task force. We want to identify commonalities across the agendas, regions, and national frameworks. We want to establish a mechanism for expert guidance and multi-directional information exchange. And most importantly, perhaps, we want to really promote scholarship and dissemination of psychological science as applied to the SDG. We're really very invested, as some of my colleagues in here will know with data. And we're really focused on thinking through how can we harness and collate relevant psychological data for the SDG. For the second component, which is on education to promote awareness and engagement, we want to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals, where we are aiming to incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals into international, regional, and national conferences and leadership capacity building initiatives. And we're doing this with specific conferences and events in mind, most immediately with the European Congress of Psychology in July 2017, with the inaugural Pan-African Psychology Conference, which is scheduled for September 2017, and with our own Caribbean Public Service Symposium on Suicide Prevention. And we really are looking forward to working very closely with PAHO, if they will have us, and other partners, other key stakeholders in terms of hosting this symposium on suicide prevention. As you may know, Guyana has the highest suicide rate in the world, and Suriname and Trinidad are also extremely scary in terms of their suicide prevalence. So it's an area for massive attention regionally. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have our regional conference in 2018 next year in Havana, if we don't have any other impediments with what's happening, you know where. US. With our third component of the preliminary strategic plan, which is about building a transformative foundation, looking at education and training, we are really intending to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals and have been mobilizing towards this, especially in the Caribbean context, through undergraduate and graduate curriculum. So this is where we focus on targeting the next generation of psychologists and also persons in allied professions. So it could be allied health professions, but it could also be persons who are not doing anything remotely. I shouldn't say remotely, because I don't believe there's anything that's not remotely health related, but anything that isn't directly health related. So in terms of students who have to do electives and may choose to do psychology, we really want to expose them to the Sustainable Development Goals in a comprehensive way through the courses that they'll be getting experience with. And then empowering and promoting citizen participation, particularly in the young democracies of the world. And here is where we are going to use timely and relevant psychological data for intersectoral accountability. So final thoughts, we are very aligned with regional partners such as PAHO in terms of understanding how health and the Sustainable Development Goals manifest in our Caribbean realities and the work that needs to be done in our specific Caribbean context, which are extremely diverse, as we know, and which we need to find some type of mechanism that can bind those diversities or link them in a way where we can be more focused on action items. And action items in terms of governance, health, and development. We want to harness our expertise. We believe that there is a strong expertise. We have seen this time and time again, particularly in the health arena, where the Caribbean has been a global leader in terms of the fight on, and I'm sure Tarlene is going to be talking about this, non-communicable diseases, for example. And so we really want to harness this expertise and this leadership in ways in which we bring our voices much more powerfully to the conversations on Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ishta. And we move on to Dr. Tara Malcolm, who works with us at PAHO, and she will be presenting NCDs in the Caribbean and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I know we're small in numbers, but good morning. Good morning. Thank you. We know that NCD, non-communicable diseases, is a major problem, public health problem throughout the world. And we know the 4 major causes of death: your cardiovascular diseases, your cancer, diabetes, and these have 4 risk factors in common: the tobacco use, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, and harmful use of alcohol. But what is also common among these diseases is that these are lifestyle diseases that are influenced by our behaviors. Why is NCD matters? Why are we looking at NCD? This is because figures have shown that in 2014, more than 14 million people died from NCDs between the ages of 30 and 69. And this is our productive age group. And what is also important is that majority of these deaths are premature, which means that they can be prevented. What it also shows is that in the Caribbean, 3 out of 4 people die from an NCD. And 40% of those deaths are what we call premature deaths. Again, when you look at how the Caribbean or the non-Latin Caribbean compare to the other regions, you can see again that the highest rate is among our non-Latin Caribbean countries. When we compare the Caribbean to the rest of the region of the Americas, it also shows with the region of the Americas 15.6% premature death due to NCD, while in the Caribbean it's 19.3%. So NCD in the Sustainable Development Goal is the culmination of multi-year political effort started by the Port of Spain Declaration in 2007, where the Caribbean heads of state led the fight to unite to stop the epidemic of chronic NCDs. And this was followed by the Moscow Declaration in 2011. And the next high-level meeting to discuss NCD and the progress in achieving some of those targets is in 2018. So we have some global NCD targets. And many of these targets, as you can see again, is looking at those risk factors. We have our behavioral risk factors, we have some of the biological risk, but we also have our health system being able to deal with these. So these are contained in our plan of action on global monitoring framework for NCDs, which call for the achievements of 9 targets by 2025. And the overall goal is to achieve these through 1, primary prevention of common risk factors for NCD, reducing the biological risk factors, and strengthening the health system for NCD management. We also know that 80% availability of affordable basic technology and essential medicines, and at least 50% of eligible people receiving drug therapy and counseling to prevent heart disease and stroke. But how can these targets be met? These are our SDGs, and we are all aware of Goal 3, which is referred to as the health goal. But what is also important is to look at the number of targets that are also related to our NCDs. So Dr. Jack mentioned earlier that the SDG health goal is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Target 3.4 look to reduce the mortality due to NCD and improve mental health. 3.5 look at strengthening the prevention and treatment of substance abuse. 3.6 look at reduced mortality due to road traffic injuries. 3.A strengthen implementation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And 3.B look at access to affordable essential medicine and technology. What we have to also look at is the link between health, NCD, and the wider SDGs. And this morning when we entered the room, Dr. Jack and I were saying, well, we still have a lot of work to do to get people to understand the importance of health in everything that we do. Because we have to see how health is linked to everything else that is happening. And when we look at Goal 3, there are so many other areas. If you look at Goal 1 that look at no poverty, NCD is linked here. Because what research has shown and what we have understand is that there is a heavy cost or high cost associated with caring for persons with NCD. And therefore, with this high out-of-pocket spending, then persons are prone to poverty because they will spend so much on healthcare. But why are NCD relevant to the SDG? Well, the Rio Plus 20, the SDG can only be achieved in the absence of NCD. So they have acknowledged that the global burden and threat of NCD constitute one of the major challenges of sustainable development in the 21st century. If you have a very sick population, can they be productive? There are going to be issues in getting persons to really achieve their full potential. We also know that NCD can lead to impoverishment from long-term treatment and care costs. And NCD leads to high burden of disease, low quality of life, and of course, loss of human potential. So when we look at accelerating the SDG progress, we see that not all goals can be pursued equally and at the same time. So we have to pursue catalytic actions which impact across multiple SDGs. So we look at cross-sectional collaborations. We have to look at identifying and investing in what we call accelerators, which are intervention areas that can yield multiple dividends. So investing in one area that can impact on a number of other areas. We also have to look at the bottlenecks that limit progress for developing intervention. And of course, we have to look at adopting innovative acceleration solutions across countries. And to support countries in the SDG prioritization and acceleration, the UNDG is producing an online platform of tools for accelerating the SDG achievements. So the way forward, we have, our WHO PAHO has what is called the Best Buy, and these are interventions to address NCDs. These interventions does not require a lot of financial investment to achieve certain outputs. So these are things that countries can implement without significant costs associated with implementing these. And this is targeting those risk factors that leads to those 4 major diseases that were mentioned earlier. So the WHO has a global coordination mechanism on NCD, and the scope of this mechanism is to facilitate and enhance the coordination of activities, the multi-stakeholders engagement, and action across sectors at the local, national, regional, and global level. And in order to contribute to the implementation of this global NCD Action Plan 2013-2020, they are focused on 5 functions: to advocate and raise awareness, to disseminate knowledge and information, to encourage innovation and identify barriers, to advance multi-sectoral action, and to advocate for mobilization of resources. And this is the UN agencies working with the member state, working with the non-state actors. When we bring closer to home, or to the Caribbean, we have the UN Multi-Country Sustainable Development Framework in the Caribbean that is built on 4 pillars. And within the Caribbean, we will be using the Country Implementation Plan, the CIP, in which NCD is an integral part to ensure that we are working together to achieve the task of reducing NCD in the Caribbean. What we want to make sure that persons understand is that each goal is important in itself. But what is also critical is that all of these goals are interconnected. And if that is so, it means that we have to work together. So for the NCD to be able to achieve the SDG, it is important that there be whole of government, whole of society approach. We have to utilize the health in all policy, multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder action, and these working together can address NCDs in all the settings. So it is time for us to scale up our action, and it's important, as I mentioned, based on the connectivity between the different SDGs, that we work together to get the job done.
Thank you, Tara. And now we move on to Dr. Jean Morse. Dr. Jean Morse will present on dual university system health research partnerships as a foundation for sustainable development goals.
Okay, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting us to present. And I'm really presenting kind of a work in progress, and I'm representing really all of these authors who have contributed to this project, primarily led by the University of the West Indies, Professor Lindo is really our key leader. Dean Fletcher, who's here, is also one of the originators with Principal McDonald, and really what we're doing is working together to develop some plans for health research. I'm kind of a newbie to the world of UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm pretty much a biomedical researcher, and so what we're trying to do today is bring together many of the things that I think drive university-based health research with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I don't need to really tell this group about all of these landmarks that have been the result of a lot of work on the part of a lot of people. But I do think it's important to recognize that, in particular, the 2030 Agenda includes the premise of no one left behind, which I think is key, and I'll mention that a bit later. Also, I think it's also key that there are partnerships for island countries that are developing together, and these really are working on a global basis. But my bottom bullet here is really the key that started us going, which is there's a lack of resources within Caribbean countries, and that creates a difficult environment for conducting research. My background in this area is primarily working through the Fogarty Center with countries in Southern Africa, where the theme is capacity building. So when the research is done, the system continues to grow and meet the needs of its local research priorities. What did we start to do? Well, we started out really with a connection between SUNY, State University of New York, primarily where I'm from in Buffalo, New York, but also there was a larger group that was putting together a collaboration between SUNY and UE. That has led to the Center for Leadership and Sustainable Development, which I would call a kind of a high-level collaboration think tank. And our goal was to have the SUNY Global Health Institute be a link between that higher level of planning across systems, down at the basic level of what faculty are doing, what research, how does that impact on the local needs and the health priorities. And so we were hoping that our initial collaboration would result in a 5-year plan, figure out how to make 2 large systems work together. Anecdotally, where I am, it's hard to get the people on the 2nd floor to talk to the people on the 3rd floor. So we're trying to get a large system in New York State to work with a large system in the Caribbean. I think we're doing pretty well, as I'll show you. Foster collaboration among students as well as faculty, and begin to also promote the cultural exchange that's needed so that researchers in New York working on different health areas will learn by working with collaborators in Jamaica and the Caribbean. SUNY Global Health Institute is shown here. What I really want to show you on the left side here is that we have 64 campuses in SUNY. These are the primary university centers, and what we have is the power to bring together a lot of resources through this Global Health Institute. And this is now about 3 years old within SUNY, and on the right here you can see we have Global Health and Life Sciences commercialization. That brings in a lot of partnerships, business development, entrepreneurs, and so on. So this institute was kind of given a partial mission to take what SUNY and UE were doing and work with the leadership at UE to bring this all forward. So like any good group, we had a lot of meetings. We began discussing with campus leadership what needed to be done, particularly within the medical center here, and develop a needs assessment and focus on some pilot phase planning that would really jumpstart this. What we came up with was a collaboration that in the middle is this health research faculty collaboration, so it's got representatives from both SUNY and UE, and as I was mentioning, would lead to the health research priorities that were identified, as well as integrate the educational programs that were associated with both systems. So in terms of a clinical research center plan, this would be an organized center that would be a portal into a facility that would help a number of different researchers at the university within Jamaica, and ultimately we hoped within the Caribbean. The faculty came up to Buffalo. We have a large clinical and translational research center there. I won't go through all the different resources, but the idea was to think about how we could connect them and what would this look like? This is kind of a complicated series of boxes, but in the center is this clinical research center that we were talking about. On the right side, the blue boxes are kind of the resources that are located at the University of Buffalo, in addition to the SUNY Global Health Institute. And on the left side would be a way to connect all of this through the Clinical Research Center. You're good? Should I keep talking? Keep talking. So, as I was saying, a summary of this, which we don't have enough time to go through all these details today, but the idea would be that having a portal so that a lot of different people could have their research facilitated primarily through information technology. And it would be across health professions, it would go out into other disciplines as well. And this platform would require centralized data management, as was just mentioned in the previous presentation, but also regional and population data analytics and outcomes. So the priority areas that were identified were a result of these meetings. The meetings took place around these types of theme areas. Am I doing it here? Okay, point. Okay, I got it. So these are not necessarily disease areas, but they were areas that the faculty here felt would be key developmental areas going forward that would lead to sufficient grant funding, be in line with different policies, and be attractive to funding agencies. We kind of boiled that down to infectious diseases, this clinical research center idea, antimicrobial resistance, liver, kidney, and metabolic disease, cannabinoid sciences, and then kind of putting together cancer research, natural products, and nanotechnology. So we figured if we could get all of this going, everything would be great, everything would be jump-started, and the future would be awesome. Now all we're doing is taking this model that's from the other complicated diagram and laying it on top of all of these types of initiatives, kind of the health research priorities, and in the middle putting in the educational programs. So everything's kind of moving in the same direction. Collaboration and mentoring is key to this research capacity building. Most of our Global Health Institute has a number of Fogarty funded programs in Africa, Eastern Europe, and South America. So we were kind of building on programs that were successful, and that's what we wanted to do, and build it out from there. And the Global Health Institute itself is still kind of, I would say, in its infancy, but developing and working closely with UE. We started out with a Health Implementation Research Fellowship, which was funded jointly by UE and University of Buffalo. And this was really an idea of having a research fellow, postdoctoral research fellow, be interfaced between these two large faculty systems. We also brought in our undergraduate experts in terms of international research planning and international education. And on the right here, you can see that really what we want to do is have education that's based here, education that's based back in New York, but really use video conferencing. In my program, we have conferences weekly or every 2 weeks with the University of Zimbabwe. Everything is presented live, everything moves forward. We don't have to spend all the money on traveling back and forth. We do when we need to, but we think that these types of initiatives are key. Underpinning a lot of the research that needs to be done is the idea of laboratory sciences and the linked information technology infrastructure that's needed. Again, this is very hard to just plop in place in terms of the amount of money that's needed. We're trying to figure out a way to connect what we have in Buffalo and within the SUNY system to support the UE system while it's developing and implementing these initiatives. And we've learned that there's actually fiber optic cable directly from Jamaica to Buffalo. Runs through Florida, goes up and comes out in Buffalo, which is quite amazing, but we're very well connected to do this. Lastly, the concept here is this kind of multiplier effect. We have a lot of campuses, you have a lot of campuses. I don't really think it's a big deal anymore for people to be working together on a daily basis through Skype and email and video conferencing. To me, this is very doable. We already have examples of it. We don't have time to go through this morning, but it's working, and I see no reason for it not to work. So I think what we need to do is continue to build the framework, move things forward with very tangible examples, The research task force is getting a little tired. We need to get some new members on that group. We need to evaluate how this effort addresses the science policy interface. And so really we're more the science side. We want to generate the data through research done by investigators here that supports the local policy. And that's not an easy thing to do, and it can be done, but that's kind of what our focus has been. And we want to adapt health research priorities on an annual basis so that as things become important or less important, we have some flexibility to move back and forth. So lastly, I would just thank kind of the leadership of both SUNY and UE for thinking ahead, creating the think tank, a number of UE leadership members here at the Mona campus, as well as back at SUNY. And lastly, I would just say that I would not be here today if it wasn't for Dr. Charles Anderson, who was a native of Jamaica and grew up in the mountains here, was an internist in Buffalo most of his life. And one of the last things he did was come to a meeting we were doing with our Zimbabwe program and said, you know, we really need to think about doing this with Jamaica. And so, unfortunately, he's not with us any longer, but I'm here, and I'm proud that I was able to wear my sport jacket, even though I was pretty warm coming in.
Moving on, thank you, Jean. And we now move on to Dr. Sharia Myrie. And it's inner city dropout girls' use of marijuana and tobacco to cope with community violence exposure. So,
all right. So, good morning, everyone. Okay. Now, since we have limited time of 15 minutes, I'm just gonna get straight down to business. What I'm gonna do for you today, or this morning, is I'm gonna provide you with some interesting data and thought-provoking data on the impact of community violence exposure on substance use, particularly marijuana and tobacco use among a selected sample of inner-city girls in Jamaica. I'm gonna have to try to put my hands on it to get going here. All right, so just an outline here. What I'll do is I'll just jump into telling you the rationale for the study, then highlighting quickly some of the key literatures, and then explaining the study's methodology, and then I want to spend some time on the good stuff, the findings, right? And I'll wrap up with some conclusion and recommendation that I made from the study. So, we know substance use is not high on our research and policy agenda, especially substance use amongst girls, right? There's a dearth of research or empirical data on the impact of community violence exposure and substance use amongst adolescent girls in Jamaica. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there is evidence that suggests that substance use amongst girls have increased over the last decades to equal or even surpass in some cases boys or their male counterparts. And also, we all know, based on given the high incidences of crime and violence in some areas, urban inner city areas in Jamaica, that a lot of adolescent girls are at risk or at disproportionate risk of experiencing community violence exposure. And then putting it in the context of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, right? We are well aware that substance use in itself, especially amongst adolescents, is a public health concern, right? We know that we've established that a long time ago. And for girls particularly, the studies have shown that substance use results in severe health risk and other psychosocial risks, such as brain damage, depression, anxiety, addiction, and even poor academic outcomes. There are some studies that suggest that even at a lower rate of use in relation to boys, girls are at risk of experiencing these severe consequences. And what it does is these consequences actually stagnate, as we know, girls' healthy development and their ability to transition into healthy, productive women in Jamaica, which is what we want, right, in order to achieve our goals, the 2030 goals. So my main point or argument that I make is that with our current plans to achieve the 17 sustainable development goals, and particularly goal 3, which is ensuring the healthy lives and promoting well-being for all individuals, we need increased research as well as policy intervention that targets the prevention or reduction of substance use amongst girls, right? We studies like this one that I've done that elucidate some of the predictors of substance use for girls, such as community violence is a good starting point for developing or strengthening that comprehensive, evidence-based and gender-responsive substance use prevention and reduction policies that will be geared towards. Alright, so she's giving me the 10 minutes mark. So let's quickly run through the literature, right? Basically, community violence refers to the vicarious and direct experiences of interpersonal violence committed in communities between individuals who are not related. And the forms of community violence include hearing about, witnessing, knowing, and being direct victims of community violence. And the literature has suggested that there is a connection between community violence exposure and substance use amongst girls. And pretty much what it purports is that girls use substance use as a mechanism for those internalizing and externalized response for coping with those challenge problems resulting from substance use. And so for this study, it emanated from my PhD dissertation, which is finally done, right? And in a nutshell, what this it did, my dissertation explored the psychological, the sociocultural, and the historical factors that contributes to drug use amongst dropout girls in selected inner city communities in Kingston and St. Andrew. And for the studies overall, I used the feminist standpoint research, which we know is grounded in women and girls' lived experiences and their viewpoints. So it's a qualitative study, goes in depth. I did a semi-structured interview with 15 girls, and it spent about 3 weeks in the 6 communities in Kingston and St. Andrew there, and did an in-depth interview with them. So the findings now from the study. All right, just a disclaimer here, right? The findings, I should put it out there that I'm gonna first the names of the places I'll mention and the girls, they're all pseudonyms. Secondly, because this is a girl, it's a qualitative, it's a feminist approach, and it's delving into the viewpoints and the lived experiences of the girls. I kept the authentic, the quotes in patois, so forgive me if some persons will not be able to understand the language per se, and also there may be a little bit of graphic use of language here, so if anybody is offended, forgive me for that. It's just that this is coming directly from the girls' viewpoint and from their lived experiences. So the first finding is that the girls in this study, while I started out exploring the use of any substances, the use of mostly spliff. Everybody know what spliff is, right? Marijuana and tobacco mix, and cigarette was found. Most of the girls said that they smoke spliff and cigarette. There was one girl, interestingly, that said that she smokes spliff, but she also uses spliff mixed with cocaine on occasion when she needs to get a little bit more high than usual. And as expected, the girls, they reported that their communities are plagued with persistent violence, unemployment, poverty, and availability of marijuana, as we know, because they are low-income communities. For example, I think it was Sage, she said that in her community, she said, every minute there is a different war. Who for head bust, who for head chop out, who gets shot, or who gets stabbed up. Likewise, Buttercup, she said that in my community, the people, they mix up who said this, who said that, this one said she never said so, this one said that you said that. Call it half of them in here don't work. I would say majority. Most of them are on the roadside. Buttercup also went on to explain that in her community, weed is easy to get. Them sell at every shop, she said. $20 a bag. You just go and buy it and buy a Whistler for $10 and grab it for $10 and them money there. You just buy it, bill it, and smoke your weed. She also said that cigarette sells at every shop in her community. The girls, they also reported or disclosed that they hear about, and these are the forms of violence, forms of community violence exposure, which is hearing about, witnessing, and knowing victims of community violence. So, for example, hearing about violence, Jasmine, she shared that in my community is a bad community. Most time you all hear say them kill man, them shoot after them one another and stuff like that. And more than half of the girls in the study disclosed that they have witnessed acts of violence. They've been bystanders on more than one occasion to acts of violence and severe acts of violence. For example, Blossom, she she told a story about she was just on her balcony her building one day when the members of one gang accosted a man from another gang, and she gave a very vivid description of how she witnessed that murder, she along with other community members, right? And she went through and she told a story that the man said, the man said, you need to leave the scheme, and the other one said, me nah leave, and he said the other one took the gun and shot him in his foot. Then the man stand up like this, but the blood was running out of his foot. Him lean up on the shop, him lean up on the shop. The next boy came and take back the gun and shot him in the chest right here. She was pointing, which show you the vivid description. This was 2 years later, and she can still give description of what happened that day, right? And I'll make the point later how traumatizing that can be or is for her, right? She said, she continued and said, him shooting my chest right here. The man dropped on the ground, and the next one said, finish him. You know, she said, him dead already. Right? And there were many more stories that the girls told that about witnessing. Daisy, for example, recall how one night she was at a party, and then gunmen, she came face to face with a gunman when shots erupted. Right? She said that she had to run, and when she ran, she said by the time she went up to the road, I have to run go back up the road. When me look, a bear shot a fire. She said, when me look, me see the man with the gun, him raise it down and then him look on me and me hold my head straight. And then me broke the car and me start run. Me run and a beer gun shot. Me a ball say me want my mother. You see, when me hear the bloop, 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 me say, not tonight, Lord, me a turn Christian. You see, when me hear the bloop, 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 me go up on the ground and say, Jesus, me not tonight, I'm not ready for dead yet tonight. She said she lay down on the ground and crawled all the way home. Right? And so this is just some of the experiences witnessing. The girls also all of the girls have had close families and friends that have been victims of community violence. I think 5 of them, they said that they were family members. I think Ginger, her brother, got killed in a drive-by shooting when he was 17 years old, she disclosed. Violet's father got shot 20 times, she said, in a drive-by shooting by gang members. Hibiscus and Daly also reported that their best friends got shot and killed by police in a police gang crossfire. And what basically I found in this study is that all of these experiences of community violence exposure results in multiple externalizing and internalizing problems for girls, such as intense fear, frustration, insomnia, helplessness, remorse, insecurity, anger, aggression, you name it. All of these problems, they tell you, and you see in their narratives, it comes out. For example, Blossom said that when she witnessed the murder, she said that she couldn't sleep. And even to date, when she shuts her eyes, or even if she passes the scene, she actually re-experiences, and you know that the psychological association that re-experience traumatic event is a symptom of PTSD. So, and the anger, Camila said that, you know, in her community, she said too much gun, nobody don't know how to talk things over, and when them catch up, them just make people coward in here. Yeah, I'm afraid bad. I don't know when we might get shot. I wish them just take out all the gunmen them and lock them up. And this indicates that the frustration, the anger, all of that comes out in all the participants' stories and their narratives. And finally, the most important piece is that the participants, they smoke. When they tell a story, they said that for them, smoking marijuana, smoking spliff, smoking cigarettes is a means of relieving and coping with these internalized and externalizing problems that they result from community violence exposure. For example, Ginger, when I'm talking about her brother and the death of her brother, she said, "Me watch him video, I grow up and remember these things. And me feel it, and me say, boy, mankind wicked. More time you feel like you cry, you just smoke, and it gives you a meditation. More time you think back about all of the things them, and just free life. Most time I say life hard, you understand? Till me just smoke the weed, and it give me a nice smell, and me just say, yeah. More time me just free. If me free say my brother did alive, things would have better. So it just give me advice to just meditate more time and say, boy, life really messed up. Right? And these are the kind of stories. This is the relieving and the calming effect that smoking marijuana, smoking cigarette are a mixture of these that the girls actually disclosed and the study found. And pretty much for discussion, I went on to say it's consistent with the literature that, for this study, it's consistent that community violence exposure increases girls' risk of adverse health outcomes, right? Community violence is associated with girls' substance use, right? But what this study does is where it adds an important contribution to the literature. It examines in depth what is the nature of this connection, and it's through these coping mechanisms that I went into. And I also went on to discuss the role of gender role, socialization, and conformity to feminine traits and behavior that actually can explain the girl's inclination to smoking to cope, right? I discussed that conformity to feminine norms and traits is likely spawns passiveness, withdrawal, greater needs for affiliation and interpersonal relationship, and other emotion-based behaviors that are known to heighten susceptibility to negative emotional states, such as depression and likely use of substance use amongst girls. And basically what I concluded was that it's the coping and the stress, is coping with the stresses of community violence is a pathway for substance use for dropout girls in inner city communities in Kingston and St. Andrew, and that we need increased research. We need these evidence-based policies in order to strengthen intervention policies and evidence-based intervention policies and programs. Since coping mechanism was a finding, I suggested strengthening programs that increase positive coping skills for girls, programs that help girls that are directly and indirectly victimized by community violence help make sense and cope with trauma of such experiences.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Sharia. And I know you had a marathon. Yeah, I know you needed more time, but I really, it's difficult to say enjoy, but I appreciate the presentation. So I think we're going to have some good discussion following this. So we have and I think it's going to be our last presentation of the morning, and then go on to discussion. And the name that you see here is the person who is going to do the presentation is not the name that you see here. So you would see Cesar Nunez's name is written there, but Dr. Dawn Fotheringham will do Fast Track AIDS Response in the Caribbean.
So good morning, everyone, and the name of the presentation today is Fast Tracking AIDS Responses in the Caribbean and linking it to the Sustainable Development Goals. So my first question really is AIDS still an issue? I'm sure many persons have noticed that HIV is no longer on the front burner. It's not on the news every night, it's not discussed widely, it's not seen anymore, it's not the front burner of our consciousness. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is the sense of urgency and concern around HIV the same any longer? And if not, why is it that citizens do not see AIDS as a public health threat any longer and a personal threat? I think we can attribute the complacency that we're seeing globally and regionally to two key issues. One has a lot to do with the biomedical interventions and innovations that have taken place in the recent years that have made AIDS a more manageable disease. And secondly, I think we can attribute it again to the understanding by the population of what this means. And many people interpret it, including those that we identify as quite vulnerable to HIV, as AIDS no longer being a challenge. We have a problem. We have a solution to the problem. And what I want to say today, to start off my presentation, is the reality is that AIDS is still a challenge, and it is an expensive challenge, because treating AIDS over the long term requires a lot of resources, human as well as financial. So a word of caution as we start. We should keep in mind that just because we don't see something doesn't mean that it isn't there. HIV is still very present with us. So to contextualize the presentation, what is Fast Track and why does it matter for the Caribbean? Fast Track is in essence a strategy that emphasizes the need to accelerate the response to AIDS via ambitious goals to be achieved in 2030. By 2020 and by 2030, the Fast Track argues that if we undertake certain actions between now and 2020, we will be able to build on those investments to achieve the end of AIDS by 2030. But how will this acceleration, how will this strategy that emphasizes the acceleration of the response take place, and how will it be funded? The first thing is that we at UNAIDS and globally, our leaders have committed to using data to inform evidence-based, right-centered programming that makes better use of our dwindling resources. And we all know the resources are dwindling in the region. To make better use of our dwindling resources, to target populations in the locations where they're situated. In that way, the strategy aims to reach both critical prevention goals, treatment goals, and zero discrimination goals. The UNAIDS strategy that we follow between 2016 and 2021 articulates the fast track approach, and it is one of the first strategies of the UN agencies that actually aligns itself to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So, what is the link between fast track and the Sustainable Development Goals? We know from the previous slide that the Sustainable Development Goal number 3 is where AIDS is situated. But what I want to emphasize is that prior to the SDGs, we had the Millennium Development Goals. And under the MDGs, HIV was a standalone item. It was a goal in itself. Today in the SDGs, we are talking about integrating, removing HIV from isolation and integrating it across the SDGs, making it a goal that has to be achieved across a number of SDGs, not just under SDG number 3. And that means not just taking it out of isolation, but in basically underscoring the importance of linking with other health challenges of the 21st century, like NCDs, which Dr. Malcolm spoke to so eloquently, cervical cancer, TB, and the correlation between TB and HIV, and so on and so forth. I mean, I could go on, but we don't have time. So what I want to say here is that the other SDGs in which you see HIV reflected are SDG number 5, which is all about gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, looking at how men and women can transform their behavior and promote healthy norms to reduce gender-based violence and to reduce the risk and impact of HIV. Then we have SDG number 10, which is all about reducing inequalities. And that's basically saying that everybody should have equal access to services and to commodities, including young people who we know in the Caribbean are often denied access to services because of laws that do not allow them to get there without permission from elders. SDG 16 talks about peace and justice. This is all about the punitive laws, looking at legislation, looking at policies that inhibit and restrict access to the services, particularly for certain communities. Because we know in the Caribbean we have a number of countries that have on their books statutes that are not enabling to certain populations. And last but not least is SDG number 17, which is something that UNAIDS used, this concept of partnerships to achieve a goal in order to manage the AIDS epidemic. And so we underscore, as both presenters, Dr. Malcolm and Ishtar did, the importance of partnerships to achieve our objectives. And PAHO, of course, is one of our key partners. So now we talk about fast tracking and we talk about accelerating, but at the same time we're talking about the fact that we have dwindling resources. So exactly how do we expect to fast track? What is it that has made it different to allow us to fast track towards ending AIDS in 2030? And the key game changer, the key factor has basically, what has changed on the landscape has been this concept of treatment as prevention. And what does that really mean? Unpacking what does treatment as prevention mean? It basically means that it is a strategy, it is an approach, a prevention mechanism approach that uses treatment to achieve the prevention target. How does that work? It means that once a person is diagnosed with HIV and they are immediately put on treatment, and most importantly, they adhere to their treatment regimen, they reduce the risk of transmitting HIV by up to 96%. And what does that really mean in the long run in terms of accelerating the response? It means, first of all, you immediately ensure that you can reduce the number of new HIV infections. You immediately ensure that people living with HIV in the Caribbean and globally are living longer, healthier, and more productive lives. And last but not least, you reduce the number of deaths that are AIDS related. So it's very important, this game changer. So let's look at it in the concept and in the context of the Caribbean and what the Caribbean progress has been in terms of fast tracking. I just want to remind you that there are treatment, prevention, and other targets. Today, because of time, I'm just going to use the example of treatment as to illustrate what the Caribbean can do and where we are in terms of treatment. So the global targets are basically that by 2020, 90% of people living with HIV will know their status. And of those 90% of people that know their status, 90% of them will be on treatment, on antiretroviral therapy. And of those 90% who are living with HIV and on antiretroviral therapy, they will see that their viral load, which is the amount of virus, HIV virus, in their body, will be insignificant. It will not be detected by current blood tests. What we hope is by 2030, we will increase that number to 95% of the people living with HIV, knowing their status, 95% on treatment, and 95% of those on treatment virally suppressed. So what's the Caribbean progress towards the 2020 targets? Look at the slide and you can see. Sorry about that. Where we can see that in the Caribbean at this time, 61% of people living with HIV know their status. Of that 61%, half of them are on treatment. And of those 50% that are on treatment, a quarter of them are virally suppressed. So we do have some way to go. This slide here is showing you the percentage of people living with HIV who are on antiretroviral treatment in the Caribbean as of 2015. You see the number of countries, it's just a cross-section that I pulled up, and it shows you that some countries are doing better in achieving that target. And then we can look at the top figure, which is a regional figure, and see that we're 50% of the way towards achieving that target. So we basically show that we need to step it up. We really need to accelerate. We need to help countries to achieve the target of reaching 90% of people knowing their status, etc., etc. Okay, what can we do in terms of helping the countries to achieve the targets that have been identified in the political declaration of 2016 and in the fast-tracking targets? There are three key recommendations. One is political commitment, second is prioritizing community interventions and doing sustainability and transition planning. Political commitment. We know that in 2016, countries in the Caribbean, were part of 100 countries that signed on to the political declaration on AIDS at the UN General Assembly. And there are many targets under the political declaration, and what we know and what we need to do as stakeholders in the room, agencies, individuals, we need to advocate with our political leaders to translate those commitments into actionable items. because having a commitment is not achieving the goal. It's just the first step. What does that mean basically? The commitment is a declaration. So if we're going to achieve SDG number 3, we need to ensure that there's an alignment of our national strategic plans at country level with the targets, with the treatment targets, with the care targets, with the zero discrimination targets, and so on. And to illustrate what I mean about ensuring the countries translate the commitments into action, we see that there is a policy which is linked to the 1990 issued by WHO that is called treatable. In some regions it's called test and treat. That is that once you test positive, you immediately go on treatment. In the Caribbean, you can see that these 7 countries that we've pulled up have all committed to adopting and implementing, not just adopting, but implementing the Treat All guidelines. But of the 7 that have committed, only 2 have actually started to implement. And we are in the middle of 2017. So we know that Barbados and Haiti have begun implementation. We need to scale up. We need to hold our leaders accountable if we're going to achieve SDG number 3. The second issue, or not issue, the second recommendation, and which is a priority, is community interventions. Communities have been at the center of the AIDS response, and they have been at the center of many responses in terms of epidemics. And we could look at Ebola, we could look at many others where communities have formed, have been a platform. They've been activists, they've been advocates, they've been watchdogs, they've been monitors. But what we need now is to encourage them to expand their role, to make their role more concrete in terms of achieving the SDGs. Why do we say that? Because we know that there are populations that are difficult to reach, and that many state bodies and do not have the key to unlock, but communities have that key. They can be gatekeepers for us, for those who are in the health systems. And what we're saying is that we need to capacitate, we need to empower first of all, and capacitate community to enter those communities and encourage the fast track approach. 2, to capacitate them and integrate them into the health systems so that they actually can provide testing services. They can actually encourage and be treatment advocates to ensure that when persons test positive and start treatment, that they stay on treatment. This is critical. If we are going to achieve the goals that we have discussed already, we need the community to be stepping up. And last but not least is sustainability and transition planning. And I refer to the fact that we have dwindling resources in one of my earlier slides. So what does this mean? What does this mean? It means that as donor funds, external donor funds, are withdrawn or dwindle or evaporate completely in the region, how are we, countries in the region, going to own our response? How are we going to fund our response to ensure that we don't see an escalation of the epidemic? And the only way to do that is to ensure that we plan accordingly. We cannot wait until the day there is no money left. And to do that, we encourage at UNAIDS that transition plans should be undertaken. You need to scan the environment. Every country needs to scan the environment to examine where the gaps are, what is their current plan, who they are reaching, what is the cost to them in reaching the communities, the cost of treatment, which as we know is expensive, is a long-term lifetime treatment, and how best we can address them. So this will assist countries and governments in planning how to respond to the HIV epidemic and how to own it, basically. So sustainability plans will focus on how to shift the donor-funded HIV response to locally owned, domestic investment plan by governments. I am at the end of my time, and I thank you so much for your time, listening, and to be part of the discussion on ending AIDS and ending AIDS in the context of the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My presentation this morning will be a recommendation for a policy framework for unintentional accidental poisoning for children through bleach in Jamaica. And the presentation will be in 3 sections. The first part will talk about the global problem of poisoning. For the second section, it's the Jamaica story. And for the third part, we'll be talking about the recommended interventions for Jamaica. So the question is asked, can we prevent accidental poisoning? And the researchers said that unintentional injuries, they're not accident, but they are rather predictable and preventable. And that's one of the things in Jamaica is that we have a lot of unintentional poisoning happening, and we can actually prevent them if we put the necessary measures in place. Now, the statistics for poisoning globally, from the WHO data, it shows that in 2012, there was 193,000 plus deaths as a result of poisoning, and then 84% of this was accounted for low and middle income countries, of which Jamaica would fall in that category. And the annual death for unintentional poisoning then for children was 23,000. Household chemicals are one of the main causes of unintentional poisoning, and children 0 to 5 years are the main victims. It accounts for 22.9% to 69.2%, and the case fatality rate is 7.8%. Now, what is the story here in Jamaica? The age group that is mainly affected in Jamaica is 0 to 5 years. 80% of our confirmed annual statistics is for that age group, and 62% of that is for 0 to 2 years. Now, in terms of the trend, and I actually manually tried to put this together because we have problems in recording information in Jamaica. But what we can see happening is that it doesn't really matter how low or high our confirmed cases are annually. Children remain to be the major ones that are affected, and they're falling at the lowest percentage of 77 and the highest of 82%. Now, why is it that bleach is a problem today, and why is it that I chose to do a study on bleach poisoning? Now, over the years, we've had transition in what were the main agents in accidental poisoning in Jamaica. So we can go back to from the 1960s, and if you check the date, you would see that first it was a kerosene problem in Jamaica, then it was a pesticide problem, then it was a pharmaceutical problem, and for the past decade, it has been bleach. And what it is that we're doing about this, it's over 10 years now that bleach is affecting our little ones in Jamaica. And what are the measures that will be put in place in Jamaica to stop this from happening? So we can look at the trend in what it is that we could inference from past researches that could account for this transition. So remember back in the days, most of us, our grandparents or great-grandparents, for kerosene, we usually use it for lighting and for cooking. And then it changed, and then we start having propane gas, and then we have electric light. And so we can infer from that to say, okay, maybe that's why we had a change from kerosene. But we have not done any studies in Jamaica to really state the specific cause for the cause for the change in transition. But let me go on to bleach here. In the past, and I remember when I was a child in Jamaica, and when you're being sent to the shop to get bleach, it was actually in a package, whether it's an Ajax or a Chlorido bottle that we bought bleach in back in the days. And as I grow older, and as I become a public health professional now, I realize that we have a mass production of bleach in Jamaica. And just about every shop on the corner you can go and you can get any bottle and you can go there and can purchase bleach. So today we're here and we're sitting down, and if I'm through drinking that water and if I just need a little bleach, as soon as I drive out of this campus, I can stop at any retail shop in Jamaica and ask them how much money to fill that bottle with bleach, and it will be done. And so this is what the mass production of bleach in Jamaica, how it has contributed to the issue of accidental poisoning for children. What burden does this have, both on our health system and in our hospitals? And one of our doctors here, he drafted the statistics, and it shows for pediatrics for the years 1996 to 2001 that our hospital beds have been filled mostly with children 5 years and under due to poisoning. What is the cost to us as a people and also to the ministry? And there's not much study that is done from that. But two information I got is that in 2002, it was estimated that it was $4.2 million. And then in 2006, it was 27 million Jamaican dollars to treat 11,000 cases of accidental poisoning in Jamaica. In terms of the mortality data, we do not have any for bleach, and we can't override it to say that it doesn't happen, because there's also the case of underreporting or not reporting things that happen here. But in 2009, we can see for both pesticide and kerosene that we had 2 fatalities, and we know why, from an hydrocarbon and from a pesticide perspective, the action of that on the body. Now, this is the problem tree I came up with. And how is it that I analyzed the situation in Jamaica? And the core problem we have in the middle, it is childhood poisoning. And as you can see, when we look at the cause, and the 2 main causes I want you to focus on, okay, it is the part where we have the chemical retailers here. So we have chemical retailers selling household bleach in beverage bottles, and the question is asked, but why? So we're using the but why concept to analyze it. Why is it that chemical retailers are selling household chemical in beverage containers in Jamaica? And this is, when I ask myself the question, this is how I answer it. Retailers are not regulated in Jamaica. Why are retailers not regulated in Jamaica? There are undefined role among stakeholders, among government agencies, on who is supposed to regulate these chemical retailers. And there's another thing, there's a weakness in our public health system as a function of regulating these retailers. And the retailers, they are not monitored enough on what it is they're doing. The bleach containers also, they're not labeled and they're not child-proof. And why is this so? It is sold in bulk. Syrup bottles, soda bottles, ocean spray bottles, Pepsi bottles. Therefore, you cannot have those containers being a proper container for storage of bleach. Parents are ignorant about the dangers of bleach. And while they're ignorant, we're not having adequate educational programs in Jamaica to give parents this knowledge. Then we have the lack of follow-up in our surveillance system. So when we get the surveillance data each year and we see the number of cases and we see what is happening, then we don't have any information on what are the interventions that take place according to what is shown, and how do we evaluate our interventions, what happened and what's the next step after that. And then we look on the effects that this might have, both on us as a people, on our economy, and on families. And we can have loss in production for parents who have to take their children to the hospital, for the time taken off, for the time taken for the child to be in the hospital. In terms of death, you might have a death of a child in a family. It's not only a burden to the government in terms of treatment in the hospital, but it's a burden to that parent who has to look about that responsibility. And then the eye incidence of childhood poisoning, the eye cost for treatment, and the possibility of the child being disabled. So the main focus, just for this session, will be parents' knowledge and unregulated chemical retailers. And I took a few case studies, and just briefly to show you exactly what is happening out there. So we have two mothers, and they tell us why it is that their child accidentally had bleach. One, the child drank it from a bulk bottle. The second one, it was left in a chubby bottle on the step, and the child drinks it. Now, this poison alert from the article, what I like to do, I usually look on what the public comments. Their comment. When you write an article, one of the best part for me is what it is that the public has to say about it. And this person comment to say, really that she has seen persons, they put disinfectant, bleach, weed killing, all of those in soda bottles. And she'll tell them that they shouldn't do it, which we all do sometimes as health practitioners. And they'll say, don't worry about it. I'll put it in a corner. The child will not get it. It has a lot to say about their knowledge, really, and what it is they know about the dangers of these chemicals. Unregulated chemical retailers in Jamaica, packaging, labeling, distribution, and that's our main problem here in Jamaica. Now, we have both established companies, which are formal companies, and we have informal companies. And both, if you go around and if you go in some of the supermarkets, you will see it. Even for some of your bulk liquid soaps, you'll see them being packaged in syrup bottles. Syrup-looking bottles, and they just have a label on it that says liquid soap, and it might give you a particular percentage of the active ingredient. Actually, if it tells you the active ingredients, but then there's nothing else on it. There's nothing to tell you if something happens to you, who you should call, what you should do, or where you should go. And you can go and test that for yourself. And the contradictory thing is that in 2011, the Ministry of Health, they sent a statement out to parents to tell them to stop storing chemicals in food look-alike container. And that is something that has been said year in and year out. However, the Bureau of Standards sent a statement out stating that it's okay for the chemical companies to put them in the bottles. The important thing is to label it. But the logics behind this is that a child cannot distinct labeling. If it's in a food container, that is the only thing that a child can associate with what is in the container. So if I take the label of that bottle and I put alcohol on it, and if the child knows that as a water bottle, it doesn't matter what I put on it, the child will consume it as if it's water. And so, this is what research has to show us. When we look at countries with similar poisoning contexts, right? It says, in terms of public awareness, using a public education program in isolation would not be effective. So if we go out and we tell people not to do it, and if that's all we do, research has shown us that that alone is not effective. Passive intervention. So if we put engineering tools on these bottles, if we do something that it doesn't need the parents to do something to the bottle, that will help them in terms of their behavior. We find out that there are certain agencies all over the world, both in the US and in Arab countries, that they have used to work intersectorally with the Ministry of Health and with other government agencies and non-government agencies to carry out the work of trying to alleviate the incidence of accidental poisoning in those countries. And the Poison Control Network is one of them. So that's where we talk about intersectoral collaboration. After having education program, we notice that person's behavior become dormant after they have become unseasoned to the information. And so we need to have something to sustain it. Now, I'm running through because I have 5 minutes, but we look on surveillance data from other countries, and there are countries who use their surveillance system to evaluate what is happening in the country. And Victoria Hospital in Australia used their coding system to see how best they can implement programs for their country. And the contrary in Uganda is that they were not tracking things enough. And so when they were doing medical triage, they too also had problems. So what's the feasibility of the policy framework? And so after looking at the situation analysis, we realized that in Jamaica, there's an issue in terms of governance. Who is responsible for what in terms of intervention for poisoning in Jamaica? Who are the key actors that need to be a part of this? And if we're going to have a policy content, what should be included in the policy? And what can we do to revamp our surveillance program here in Jamaica? So my recommendations from my study is, in terms of resource mobilization and strategy, is that we should build consensus among our key actors in Jamaica, not only health institution, but non-health institution. So if we have an issue with poisoning, we're not only going to talk about the Poison Information Network and the Ministry of Health, but the chemical companies and civil society and the parents and the schools become major key stakeholders in our discussion. Engaging and strengthening civil society for short-term intervention, we're talking about having public education program, whether we put them in our school curriculum or we let them be a part of some of the trainings that we do for health professionals. Strengthening the public health surveillance system through training in terms of how you collect data, how you collate it, how you analyze it for intervention and for implementations of programs in Jamaica. And my final and last recommendation is the policy and legislation. We need to have a specific policy and we need to have legislation for the packaging, labeling and distribution of bleach in Jamaica. It has to be distinct because bleach as a chemical, it's a different chemical from the other chemicals. And so the legislation needs to speak specifically to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much and pleasant good morning. Wanted to commend all the presentations really. I've learned quite a lot. I wanted to zero in particularly on Tara's presentation in terms of NCDs. And it did somewhat also in terms of the generalized rate of presentation on AIDS. That is, of course, you reference the leadership of the Caribbean in terms of the taking global action on the NCDs, and of course that the next review would be done in 2018. What I want to focus on really is that, and I'm based in New York, ambassador at the United Nations, and I was very much involved in that that issue in terms of the 2011, where for the first time we had the political high-level meeting and political declaration on NCDs. In fact, I negotiated that declaration on that. But we're feeling in New York we're not getting the kind of, and that's why it says linked somewhat to the presentation, a seeming lessening. I'm happy that our regional rep, UNFP, is here to hear some of this. A lessening of the intensity of the focus, the drive that we had pre-2011, and at a time when we should be ramping up. And I'm a little concerned whether we're losing the edge and the leadership in terms of this issue in particular. And as we look at the whole set of SDGs, it seems to me, especially given the burden and now the dual burden of the communicables and now non-communicable, that health in particular should be one of those SDGs that we should be championing. So I would like, I don't want to explain that one, but a mutual exploration in terms of, how can we, feel the fight a little better in terms of getting action really better coordinated, the visibility of the issue in the Caribbean, and certainly in preparation for that global review. So I want to commend you, but I think there is a bit that we need to do. In fact, just before coming here, I was speaking with our colleague, who is the WHO representative, WHO PAO in New York, with whom we collaborated a bit. And the same sentiment was expressed that, the Caribbean, I think we seem to have arrived on the issue, and we're not pressing it as much. So in terms of, and it would, I think, aid our implementation of SDG 3 in terms of ramping up, and the political visibility is so important. And I can tell you, since then, of course, we've had the whole health systems push, which is important and which we need, but we still need, given the very statistics to which you referred, in terms of the challenge for the Caribbean, it's not something that we can, just, every issue has champions, and I think they should be yours that we should keep pushing. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take another, before their answers, we'll take 2 more questions, and please go ahead.
Good morning, my name is Sandra Messiah. I work for Public Services International. We're an international trade union organization. So my focus particularly is on the workers in health. And it's particularly taken by the last presentation because it's zeroed in on the policy recommendations. And we do need to have people to get these things done. And secondly, the whole matter of public investment in health. What are your experiences and what are your recommendations and what are the things that need to be done to have the people to do the business, to get the policies in place, and therefore to achieve the various targets and ultimately the goal.
Okay, and the third question, yes. Denise.
I really wanted to comment on the fast track response to the Caribbean. It's an interesting presentation from you, and I like the three recommendations you made. Political commitment, the prioritizing community interventions, and the sustainability and transition plan. Jamaica has in fact applied the traditional assessment tool. We're in the final stages of preparing and submitting to cabinet. And these are some of these 3 areas that we have clearly outlined are some of the areas that have come out as gaps. Community intervention, outreach groups, political commitment now to actually taking over the entire budgeting of the HIV programs that we've been funded for years in order to really achieve that end date by 2030. So I think that is a very an excellent recommendation that you made. The recommendations are excellent, and we hope that other Caribbean islands will also be able to take this. And when we do make our recommendations to cabinet, I hope they have the political will to drive the response and really take over the entire budgeting for the program. I also enjoyed all the other presentations, not just making comments.
So one more question, and then we give the panelists the opportunity to respond.
Hi, good morning. Just a quick question for Jean Morse. My name is Gillian Smith, and I work with FAO here in Jamaica. I wanted to just come back to the science policy interface that you mentioned. This entire group has spoken about extremely important imperatives. How do we prioritize?
You're definitely correct. All the successes that we have had in health, from the polio eradication to the measles elimination, all required a champion. And the Caribbean started in 2007 with the Port of Spain Declaration. But as you said, it seems like we have lost that momentum. And I think the SDG really offered that opportunity, that platform to really advocate and get that intersectoral collaboration in working towards achieving these strategies to reduce the NCDs. Health by themselves cannot do it. As you can see from the risk factors, that it requires that intersectoral, that whole of government approach. And it is the opportunity for us. I must say, as health professionals, we are usually not very good advocates. But it is an opportunity for us to learn how to work, how to collaborate with the other key stakeholders so that we can drive this movement to try to reduce these NCDs in our population. As you mentioned about the public investment in health, which was the other question, that is another opportunity where we have to show that without health, there is no development. If we don't have a healthy workforce, there is no way and since we're in Jamaica, we can speak about the Vision 2030. Without health in the population, we cannot reach that vision. And therefore, as health professionals, we have to identify that we have a role to engage different stakeholders, whether it's government or non-governmental organization, and to see how we can really champion the cause to reducing these risk factors and thereby reduce the impact that NCD will have on our population.
I wanted to say I also enjoyed all the presentations, really outstanding. So I guess the question about the priorities, so I've been involved with HIV since 1983, and we're constantly having to reinvent how we should be approaching things. I think one of the things that happened in New York State, I'm not mentioning that because I'm from there, but just one of the things that the New York State governor did was initiate something called Ending the Epidemic in New York. And what that policy did was it forced everyone to reevaluate how we approach things, because number one, the money is going away. We had a lot of money for a long time where we could just say, this is our HIV program. Now it's transitioning to either a chronic infection clinic, instead of calling things an STD clinic. Now we're calling things like a chronic infection clinic. Instead of calling things a methadone clinic, we're calling them substance abuse clinics. And finally, people are realizing that the psychologists and the behavioral sciences are really the answer, even though the health researchers have come up with all the biomedical interventions, there's still many, many new infections. So the comments about the epidemic is off the front page, but it's still very important. It forces us to look at it very differently, and many people do not, when you put together a multidisciplinary team to address a problem, very often you don't get behavioral sciences and kind of biomedical research sciences to come together. NIH is forcing that now through their RFAs. You can't get grants without putting together a team to address that. So I think that's kind of a long-winded answer, but setting out what you'd like to have and then working through, even going back to pre-college through STEM and then getting college programs and then health science programs to begin to think this way so that you train a workforce who can then go out and do it instead of having everybody who's currently doing it basically being too busy because there's not enough people to do what needs to be done, and kind of reinvigorating what that pipeline looks like and blending together the whole idea of the implementation research.
I just want to make a quick comment to the lady who spoke to the issue of recommendations. I mean, I would very much like to commend the government of Jamaica, I'm sorry. See, there we go. The government of Jamaica for leading the way in the Caribbean in terms of completing transition preparedness assessment. And it is a start that other countries should follow, that we, all of us in the room and our colleagues in our organizations should lobby for, because what it establishes a precedent in a country that has a lot of money still from external donors. And what is interesting, and just to share with the community here, is that Jamaica's stance in taking this initiative and bold step, despite the fact that they have a lot of money, is acknowledged by other countries that would like to follow their lead and have approached Jamaica to use their methodology and their expertise as a tool for South-South cooperation. So I just want to commend the government of Jamaica, and as we shown in the slides where we saw Barbados and Haiti taking the lead with treatment. So just to say that we can't only look at the lapses or the lack of commitment to move forward, but look at the successes and see how we can encourage countries to replicate that.
I'll start with the questions to persons who are more in academia. So that's Ishta and Jean. And the initiatives that you have, one, Trans-Caribbean, across the Caribbean in terms of psychologists, Ishta, and Jean, with the partnership that you have between the University of the West Indies and SUNY University and so on in the US. And then what I want to see is how is that, what's your vision for translating that to the concept of the health for all persons and at all ages? Because that's where we need to get. So we have this initiative, but I want to see its translation, its scalability, its implementation into the people on the ground, the people in the communities. So you're beginning at this point, and there's always that beginning. But there is the people who are there in front of us, who live in communities as those that we've seen, Sharika and Sharia demonstrated. How do we bring it together? So academia to those communities that in which persons truly live and exist lives that are not necessarily easy and understandable to us.
Within CANPA, we do this in multiple ways. CANPA started from a grassroots type of movement with locally based, country-specific people who were agitating for more involvement and more rigorous involvement of evidence-based programming and interventions. Because what we were seeing was that people were setting up little shops on the side and calling themselves psychologists and without any appropriate training, etc. So we wanted to ensure that the health professionals, and this goes to your question, Sandra, I believe, about workforce. We wanted to ensure that the people who were being visible as the workforce were actually legitimately trained and that they were getting as much information as they needed and as many opportunities as they needed for capacity building. So from that grassroots movement and that mobilization of networks locally, we started to connect in a very nodal way to a larger Caribbean-wide, region-wide network. We also realized the importance, while we have that grassroots starts where we have our fingers on the pulse of what people are wanting within our different communities, which are country-specific. We also recognize the need to have a more meta perspective of things, to think about what are global priorities and how is what we're doing in our specific countries and at the regional level, how is that plugging into those global priorities? Because unless it plugs into those global priorities, we are less inclined, and that's putting it mildly, to be accessing funding, which is integral in terms of the work, the training initiatives, particularly again for health workforce. So we need to be plugged in at that level. And then on the side too, in terms of academia, particularly with the work that we do at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research, which was recently rebranded, as many of you know, which was Tropical Medicine Research Institute, and we were rebranded in August last year with our launch in February. Understanding and working from what our communities need is an integral part of how we function. So we don't just go do research for the sake of research. Our research is mobilized, it's driven by what our national priorities are, and figuring out how to build a research infrastructure that is supportive of those national priorities, particularly in countries in which there is not a strong research infrastructure in place.
That's a really hard question that you asked, by the way. But I guess the way that a lot of people think about this now is if you want to accomplish something by 2030 and you know what you think works, you have to figure out some type of an implementation strategy and see if that works better than whatever is happening right now. And for example, one of the first things Dr. Anderson brought me to when I first came to Jamaica was St. Anne Parish. Introduced me to the hospital, the leadership, and the clinics that are running there. And we talked about all the different problems about their patients and how to be connected to, not necessarily the university, but just to the rest of the island and meet the needs of those patients. Separately, they ran Help Jamaica, which is a mission that comes here. And the whole idea of what mission trips do, there are others who know much more than I do. But the idea is you basically help people who don't have health care, but then when the mission is over, that's gone. To me, that doesn't have to function that way anymore. And we've actually developed projects within our health research task group which could envision, somebody just having an iPad, and when the mission trip is over, each iPad for that individual is downloaded to a central database that's linked to the Ministry of Health, so the next group that comes through actually can know what was done for those individuals. I know it's a long way off, but currently the missions use clipboards. So to me, that's like a low-hanging fruit that could be tested, and those patients could be kind of kept in the system rather than being so far out of the system. And then the other thing that's happened is telemedicine. So the whole idea of telemedicine, now we have a liver disease program in Buffalo that has got a pilot project to be able to work with patients here who will ultimately be getting treated for hepatitis C. And so there's all sorts of innovations, I think. I don't think all the answer is technology, but I think getting the right people together to say, here's what we want to accomplish, how can we do it now? And then how can we do it in the context, not necessarily of saying, okay, this is how much money we need to do this, but we could do a pilot project with this program and these students and these faculty, bring together businesses in the community that have an investment in trying to help that project work. So for example, we've got an iPad manufacturer in Buffalo that wants to donate iPads to the project. So those kind of things can happen if people think out of the box, once you figure out what it is you want to accomplish. And people don't usually think of universities as thinking that way, and they think of research as somebody going in a lab to do something. But in the things that we're talking about, I think the research is really designing new systems. And a lot of, when I was reading about I can't remember the acronym for the island nations that are working on SDGs, information technology was agreed upon that was the key thing for everything to be successful. And it exists, the resources are actually there, they just have to figure out a way to be integrated, and then I think people can get innovative projects tested, see what works and see what doesn't work.
I see two so far questions from the audience. Please go ahead. Okay. Karen, you want to start?
Okay, my name is, so pardon me, sit in, please. My name is Carol Crossman Johnson, and I'm from Apple. I'm just listening to the very good presentation, congratulations to you all. But just listening to the presentations, I'm thinking about 2030 to be just 13 years from now. You know, it seems a real mammoth task that we have ahead of us. You know, so to me, everything needs to be fast-tracked. Like the AIDS, fast track everything and get things going really fast. But I know that there are challenges, and I hope that we'll overcome them in order for us to achieve our goals by 2030. My question really is, that was my comment. My question is to Sharia. For the communities, I just want to find out if substance abuse among young women is seen as a problem within the communities, and if there are efforts, programs in place that are aimed at addressing those issues.
And so, other question?
Yes, my name is Gareth Gibson. I'm with the Buffalo, Jamaica Innovation Enterprise, and I'm part of the diaspora that's interested in finding ways in which we can connect people in Jamaica and the Caribbean as a whole with individuals or groups in Buffalo to collaborate on different programs and issues. We're talking about some of the SDGs and some of the initiatives that we know will require an educated workforce in order to advance the issues. I'm interested in hearing you talk about STEM initiatives, STEM learning in the different Caribbean islands, and talk about where there are areas of collaboration in these issues. Because as you may know, in the United States, STEM is a big issue, from the federal government driven down. And I think that there are areas and ways in which we can collaborate, and I'd like to kind of hear about what you're doing here in Jamaica and areas in which you're looking for collaboration with outside agencies.
I know it seems daunting with all the goals, but the good thing for Jamaica, as was mentioned yesterday, that we have aligned the SDGs with the Vision 2030 development plans. Like on the health, even though we have 9 targets on the health, we're running X amount of indicators, they are aligned to the Vision 2030 and the current MTS, so that while we're achieving those targets and those goals under our vision, we're in essence also running with the SDG targets and indicators. Some of them are really not in the Vision 2030. Those now we would have to really make some allowances to our funding to kind of start to track those targets and indicators. But I believe all in all, if we do that kind of approach, integrated approach, then we are at a better place, I believe. We didn't achieve all the targets under the MDGs, and those who are outstanding, we still have programs that are running from that MDGs period into the SDGs period and still working towards those goals. So it seems daunting, but I believe that if we really integrate, that kind of integrated approach can get us to the end of the line, even if we don't win.
You asked that if substance use and abuse is seen as a problem, female substance use is seen as a problem, and the answer is definitely not. What we've, you know that by now that there is a gender bias, or there's an assumption that female substance use and abuse is a male problem, right? Because of, we know the trend that substance use is more, the statistics shows that boys and men are more likely to use it. However, that in the recent decades, the NCDA has done a number of surveys, especially among school population, that shows that female girl substance use, students substance use is increasing. However, we are not at the point in the communities. I've been working in most of the inner city communities for quite some time now, and it's still not seen as something that is problematic for female, although the data has shown or is showing that it is something that we should actually focus on. And along with that, because of the lack of awareness or recognition of the problematic use for female, there is no policy or program implementation within communities or at the community levels for substance use. And even I've had, when I was collecting the data for my research, I had close communication and contact with NCDA, that's National Council on Drug Abuse, and there is not any sort of gender specific, and that is something that I am actually advocating for within the organization. It's for gender-specific programs for substance use and abuse. There is the data that shows that there are unique pathways, boys and girls, males and females. The risk factors for substance use differs substantially, and such that programs and policies has to identify and recognize and implement these gender-specific risk factors in order to prevent substance use amongst girls and also amongst boys per se. And just overall, I think what she was I don't quite, but you spoke about the collaborative effort and how the strategies that we need to inform policy. And that's one of my, when I'm doing research over the years and trying to get into policy, I'm more of a researcher than a policy maker, right, and a practitioner. But I do see the need for a collaboration between researchers and policy makers, and the persons on the ground, the workers, the practitioners on the ground, right? We need the evidence first and foremost in order to inform the policies. We have long, especially in Jamaica, we've had this idea that we just come up with policies or come up with programs based on I don't know what, right? But we need scientific data, we need empirical data that informs these policies, and of course a collaboration between academia, between policymakers, between on the ground community members. We cannot forget the community aspect, right? From that, and for a strength-based, a rights-based approach, right? So communities, if we're implementing policies or trying to implement grassroots policies, bottom-up approaches, the community involvement is definitely an important piece that needs to be incorporated within the whole strategic framework. And from the research perspective, is disseminating information, right? We need to get to that point where we start all of these research. My research that I'm doing, I'm trying to ensure that it becomes, it's aware, all of the data that it becomes informed into some sort of policy, some sort of advocacy or program implementation at the community level and at the national level.
Yes, okay, to answer your question, at the core of the whole fast track strategy is the emphasis of leaving no one behind. What that means, to unpack it, because it's not just saying leaving no one behind, is that in order to really target the resources to scale up the response, we need to actually look country by country where you have a problem, where is your epidemic. And one of the things that we know is that we do have globally, I mean, of course, in certain countries, maybe in certain regions, you have different types of epidemics. the epidemic is not heterogeneous. So that basically what we do know is that you have vulnerable communities which have been identified at the global level. And they include young people, they include gay men, they include men who have sex with men, sex workers, transgenders, in particular adolescent girls and young women across the globe. That is understood. The question is now, how do we, and when I say we, I'm speaking about UNAIDS, how do we and the stakeholders that we work with, including our co-sponsoring agencies, is how do we target these communities? How do we enter those communities? And that's the context I was referring to with community, as in, first of all, identifying the data from data, what is the rate of incidence within those communities, and how best we can strategize to enter them. So that in order to not leave all of those communities behind, we need to A, have data, B, have targeted programs, C, ensure the programs that we have address the laws that inhibit and restrict access for many communities to getting services, the attitudes and the behaviors that actively promote discrimination, the laws that sometimes facilitate that discrimination. We need to examine all laws and remove them from the books. And just to use a quick example, recently in Trinidad there was the amendment to the marriage bill, And what that means for us, again, taking HIV out of isolation and fast tracking, is that we know that when young girls, adolescents get married early, they are more vulnerable to HIV. They're more vulnerable to gender-based violence. We don't want to leave them behind. They're just one community, I'm showing, and commending the government of Trinidad and Tobago for taking the initiative, which other countries have done, to ensure that the age of marriage for children is 18 and not 14 or 13. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it basically speaks to how we work with others and how we promote at the center a human rights approach at the core of all that we do.
Very quick, two quick comments. One is the NIH realized that only about 30% of its clinical trials were completely enrolling because the academics would come up with great ideas of how to do research and no one wanted to be in the studies. They revised the system. Now every academic medical center has to have something called a community engagement core, which is all the people who are never involved in actually getting people who should be involved in what was going on. The other example I have is in Zimbabwe, where all of the patients go to traditional healers first. And that's where they're getting their care. And then there was this big awakening that, well, how can we give them Western, US, and whatever, European medicines when they're getting traditional medicines? And it was a total lack of understanding the entire system, engaging the community, because the traditional healers were leaders in the community. And so I think once you figure out how those systems apply here, we should build on some of those things. And again, we can connect people who are doing it where we are to folks here who want to set up something similar and get over some of those barriers.
Is directly to Karen's question about what strategies are being used in our academic institutions to ensure that our work filters into policy. At CARE, Caribbean Institute for Health Research, we work very closely with PAHO, particularly in the EVIPNet program, the Evidence Informed Policy Network. We are also ensuring that through those types of collaborations, we're providing the empirical information, empirical data that's needed to do these rapid response policy documents, policy briefs, when our governments call upon us for that information. At CARE also, we have the Caribbean branch of the US Cochrane collaboration, which, as some of you may know, is the body that looks at systematic reviews. So we're very invested in collating empirical information and conducting meta-analyses, and also conducting qualitative research syntheses as well. And most importantly, perhaps, we've been ensuring that we have a focus, and we're building our own body of experts within the Institute in implementation science. Because we realize that there is this gap that Jean has just mentioned in terms of the evidence and the evidence getting back into the communities. And we also realize on the other side that we keep talking as though our communities are not doing things that are innovative. The fact is that they're doing lots of things that are innovative. So it's really about doing things that are taking advantage of, that are maximizing and building on the things that our communities are already doing, and focusing on our implementers and seeing how, and this gets to Jillian's question earlier about how do we prioritize, where do we start from? We start from the evidence, we start from what we're seeing across the evidence in terms of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, but we also start from the point of view of what our communities are showing us works, because and next week we have the launch of our congregations taking action against NCD study, which some of you will be attending. That's an example of a regional initiative, because it's 3 different countries participating, Guyana, Jamaica, and Dominica, where we are maximizing the advantages, the resources of the community asset that are our places of worship. So I think it's multiple ways in which we can tackle these types of issues.
Okay, so I think we're at the end of the session. We've had really some, I would say, really wonderful discussion, presentations and discussion, and really mainly have needed much more time to explore. But we have seen really to implement SDG 3, we really need to work with others. Partnerships are essential. We need to ensure we have the intersectoral approach in all, because many of the areas that we need to address to support the work of health lie outside of health. We also need to see that they remember our community. You know, basic thing in public health is the community involvement. That's what I learned and started at that point. And sometimes along the way, we forget to involve the community. We think that we know. The science or the books have said it, but we are not engaged in the communities. And this, I think, and then the other thing, and especially increasing, and in the context of power, we use a terminology called cross-cutting teams, the areas of human rights, the areas of equity, and equity mean appropriate, not just equality, but equity. We need to look at the gender, and in some instances, ethnicity, because there are many health outcomes are being, the health outcomes are being defined by these 4 factors, as well as the determinants of health. So I really want to thank you for being here, participating with us.